Hi writers and readers, I'm Christy Stratus and welcome to part 4 of my notes on Shelley Freydont's presentation at Sisters in Crime event. We are still in historical details, and one of the things that she says is if you're describing a real historical event or your story takes place around a real historical event, then you need to get the motivations correct. So essentially, it has to be accurate as to why these things happen. And that is one of the things that she said is one of the toughest things, to understand the motivations of how a historical event happened, and other than that, how the people at that time felt about it. It can be one of the most difficult things to do, she said. So when she talked about research, she said it's really important to get things like diaries and newspaper clippings and things of that ilk, so that you can really get sort of more of a good picture of what people really thought about what was going on. That's really tricky. This is something I have not had to deal with because I don't do historical fiction based around an actual event. Sometimes I'll throw in something real because it fits in the story and it's sort of just an interesting thing that I found that fits. So in Anatomy of a Darkened Heart we have the book Black Tulip by Alexander Dumas, and that just happened to fit really, really well. And I said, you know, why make up a book when I can have a real one that was published at the time period and really has perfect quotes for this book? And Abigail does read a couple of those quotes, and they really make sense in her life. They have a place there. And that brings me into when she says that just name dropping, just throwing in some kind of historical name, doesn't ground the story to be historically accurate. And the reason that she brought that up was because she was saying that there are a lot of traditional publishing companies that don't want any kind of historical fiction that is based in a real event, because it can be hard to determine actual events, to have the research that proves that this happened and that people reacted that way and that this is the politically correct this, that, and the other. Of course, there's lots of stuff out there that's historical fiction and based on real events, but apparently some traditional publishing companies are just not going in for that. And so Shelley was saying that just sticking in a name to make it sound like it's in the time period is not really good historical fiction if you're trying to ground it in a historical time period around an event, but sort of not. Apparently this is also really valid because something that's going on in women's fiction now is there's a huge movement of using historical figures and making up parts of the stories from their lives. And that's what she was saying that some publishers really don't like, trying to make up, like fill in some sections that aren't there. You don't know the character, the real people's reactions. You don't know the full story. And if it turns out to be very inaccurate for the person, or maybe there's a living relative, you could really end up in having some kind of a problem. So that was why she was making that recommendation. And she also said just to make sure that you don't feel bad if anybody leaves you a 1-star review and says something along these lines. She said no matter how accurate you are, how careful you are, doing so much research, using primary sources, she says you will get people who are saying that they know more than you, and they're going to throw a fact out there that you can disprove, but she says never engage with someone like that. And so I think it's very, very different if someone comes back constructively and says, oh, you know what, I had read this here, which kind of contradicts what you said. Did you see this source? As opposed to being like, you know, you're wrong and how dare you write this incorrect thing. You know, I think she's saying not to engage with people who are really just sort of in a bad mood or trying to put you down or something like that, because there's really no winning at that point. There's no saying, even if you say like, here's what my point is and here's where I got that from, you know, if you're reading a really negative mood of the person, then it's not worth engaging. Touching again on considering the classes of society, she also brought up the point of paying attention to how people treated each other in public versus in private, which is also very interesting because a lot of the time we might read books that have a lot to do with the public, especially when it's historical. If you're doing research in the time period and you hear what the public thinks of something or how people acted when they went for tea at someone's house, that's not necessarily a personal, private interaction, like between a husband and wife, for example, how they might speak to each other. So those interactions can be very different, and it's important to try to get those as right as possible, although I find that would be very difficult, especially the further back you go. And she also made this point, the further back you go, the more difficult it is to get people's reactions and the way people acted really accurate. If you are writing historical fiction that takes place in a time when people spoke very differently, Shelley said, don't go overboard with the language to make it sound like a different time period, because it can end up stiff and dry. And that makes a lot of sense. If I tried to write like Jane Austen or someone, it would definitely not quite be the same as reading an actual Jane Austen piece. And if you're reading my piece, it might be a lot more boring, because it wasn't written back then, and it just, trying to make it sound historically accurate but interesting to a modern reader is very different from trying to write it like someone like that. Whereas if you're reading a historical piece, you're expecting it to sound that way. But if you're reading a modern piece, it can just come across differently. Do you know what I mean? If you have an opinion on that, I'd love to hear it down below, because it's kind of like a sticky thing. I had wanted to do that actually with one piece, try to write it like someone would have from the 1800s, but then I thought it's going to be too dry. I'm just not sure anybody would be interested in that today, but of course they would be from a person at that time. And along those lines, she brought up a really interesting point. The language in historical books, she said, of the time are more stilted than in real life. That apparently the way people wrote novels back in whatever historical time period was more stilted than the way they naturally spoke. So trying to use that as an example is not even 100% accurate of real life, it's just the novel. That was a very interesting one and kind of made me really think. Then we got into the whole question of what defines a historical novel, what defines the fact that it is historical, period. And she was saying that it's very, very difficult to determine whether something is historical, because some people think that if you write something that takes place in the 70s, that's historical, like 1970s. That's historical because it's very different from now, but some people think that it's like World War II and before. So it's really up in the air. Apparently different traditional publishers feel differently as well. So I'm going to go back into that the next time, tomorrow actually, for part 5, and that will be the final part, and I will be talking specifically about how defining historical fiction can be different and how to define it in general. So thank you so much. I will see you tomorrow.